So today's video is going to be another solved true crime case. Today is part 2 of the chicken coop murders. So if you didn't catch part 1, you kind of need to watch that one before you can watch this one. I'll link it up here in the eye. Go watch that one and then come back here and we'll carry on with the story. But if we're all caught up, then before we get into the case, I just want to thank our sponsors for making this video possible, Acorn TV. Acorn TV is the biggest ad-free British streaming service with a bunch of titles from old favourites to new exclusives that you can't get anywhere else, originals. There's so much to discover, especially if you're into like mystery, crime, drama kind of shows. I rate them so highly. They do have way more than that. They have comedies and things like that as well, but the crime, mystery, drama section is where it's at for me. I recently started watching Line of Duty on there. I know, I've never watched it. Social media has not shut up about it and I see why. I'm obsessed. It's basically about this police team that are made to investigate and fight the corruption within the police force. It's intense, it's suspicious, there's murder, there's kidnap, there's prison. I love it. Acorn TV release new shows every week that you can't find anywhere else. It's totally ad-free and it's only $5.99 a month. You can watch it on pretty much any device you have as well, just from downloading the app. You can get it on your Amazon Fire TV, you can get it on Google Chromecast. If, like me, you've rinsed all your other streaming services while we've just been stuck at home for the last year, Acorn TV has thousands of hours of content for you to discover. There's always something new to immerse yourself in on Acorn TV. So if you want to try it out, you can do so free for 30 days if you go through my link, which is down below in the description, acorn.tv, and use the code Eleanor at checkout. Make sure the code is in all lowercase, otherwise it won't work. That's acorn.tv and code Eleanor at checkout. Thanks again to Acorn TV for sponsoring this video. Now let's just get into part 2 of the case. Again, before we get into it, I just want to give some content warnings, the same ones as with the first part. This case does include the harm and murder of children. The victims in this case are all children. This does involve sexual violence, sexual abuse, abuse in general, just the harm and death of children. So if that's something that you don't want to listen to right now, I totally understand. Feel free to click out, look after yourself. I'm sure I'll see you again soon. I'm just going to give you a quick little summary of part 1 and then we'll just kind of flow right into the case. So this case takes place in California, specifically kind of Los Angeles area, and in a very short amount of time, just a few months, 3 young boys had gone missing. They were all around the same age, between the ages of 9 and 12. Walter Collins was the first child to go missing. He was 9 years old, and then that was quickly followed by 2 brothers named Lewis and Nelson Winslow, who were 10 and 12. And since then, there'd been no sign of any of these 3 boys. It was as if all 3 of them had just disappeared off the face of the earth. And then a few months later, police got a seemingly unrelated report about an illegal immigrant child worker on a farm in Wineville. So they go to check this out on this chicken farm, and that was when police realized that maybe these different cases weren't so unrelated after all. This young immigrant worker was 15-year-old Sanford Clark. He was actually the nephew of the chicken farm owner, and it turned out that his uncle, the farm owner, had been brutally abusing him physically, emotionally, and sexually for the last almost 3 years. Sanford told the police that his uncle's name was Gordon Northcott. He was 21 years old, and Sanford even told them that he hadn't been his uncle's only victim. There had been other young boys round at that farm, and Sanford knew that his uncle had done way more than just abuse them. Sanford told the police about this one particular time where his uncle Northcott came home one day and he was particularly very happy. He was waving around this silver bucket and telling his nephew to look inside. So Sanford went over, looked inside this bucket, and there he saw what he believed to be a dead animal. It was covered in blood, it was all fleshy, but then Northcott said, "No, look closer." And so Sanford looked closer into this bucket, and that was when he realised that his uncle was holding a severed human head. Sanford pushed the bucket away and threw up on the side of the yard as Northcott just watched and laughed. And it was in this moment that Sanford realised what his uncle, his captor, his abuser for the last almost 3 years, what that man was truly capable of, and Sanford feared that he could be next. Northcott then asked Sanford if he wanted to hear the story behind this severed head, and Sanford knew that if he said no, he would be in trouble, maybe he'd get beaten, so he reluctantly said yes, okay. And that was when Northcott told him that he had just committed his first murder. It was a boy not much older than Sanford. Although Northcott claimed that he'd killed this boy in self-defense. He said that this boy had been trying to kill him. So before he could kill him, he killed the boy. He said that the way he killed the boy was that he shot him in the head, killed him instantly, and then decapitated him after death so that when his body was eventually found, it wouldn't be identified and then it wouldn't be traced back to Northcott. And he'd actually brought both parts of his body back with him. He had the boy's full body, headless body, in the boot of his car, and he just had the head in the bucket. Now, this self-defense story, killed this boy in self-defense, of course, is widely believed to be a lie. We don't know the story at all behind this murder, actually, so it could be true, but it's probably not, let's be honest. This is a man that is very violent towards people of that demographic. You know, his nephew is a teenage boy, and he has been very violent towards him, so it makes sense that this was just something that Northcott wanted to do. He just wanted to murder. The most believed theory is that Northcott had actually tried to abduct this boy, but this boy being a little bit older than his previous victim, you know, Junior, that he tried to abduct, it's believed that this boy was a little bit older, a little bit stronger, and he fought back. And then Northcott, maybe he genuinely did believe it was in self-defense. Maybe that boy fought him so hard that Northcott thought he was gonna kill him. Either way, Northcott committed his first murder, and now he had this teenage boy's body in his car. He demanded that Sanford go and build a bonfire in their yard, and when it was big enough, he told him to get the severed head out of the bucket and burn it on the fire so that it could never be traced back to them. As for the rest of the body, Northcott kept it in his car and then later drove out to a bridge and threw the headless body off of it into a ditch. The next morning, the headless body was found by a member of the public walking their dog. And this absolutely horrified the town, as I'm sure you can imagine. This was a child found without their head. But Northcott was right. Without that head, the body couldn't be identified. And so still, to this day, that victim has never been named, never been identified. There was no other identifying information on this person's body, no marks, no scars, birthmarks, nothing kind of that stand out that they could identify them from. Literally the only thing that coroners could tell from this victim's body was that they were probably Mexican. That's it. And sadly, that is how this poor boy has remained ever since this case took place. For almost 100 years now, this victim has been known in this case as the Headless Mexican, which I think is just awful. It's just so dehumanizing. This was a child with a whole life, you know, with hobbies and skills and thoughts and feelings, likes, dislikes. They had a whole family, a whole friendship group. They had hopes and dreams. And now, in his death, he's simply reduced to the Headless Mexican. And for that exact reason, obviously, I don't have any information about this particular victim's family or the aftermath of their murder, because a family has never been connected to this victim. And it's so sad to think that there's just a family out there somewhere that, well, probably not now because this case is so old, but they lost their son, they lost potentially a brother, or someone lost a best friend, and they never knew. They never knew what happened to him. There is one name that floats about the internet. This hasn't been confirmed, but it is possible that this boy could have been called Alvin Gotea, but that, like I say, it's literally just a potential. Anyway, after Northcott had committed his first murder and disposed of the body and the head, he then decided to grab Sanford and flee Wineville for a while. This is presumably so that the two of them would have an alibi. They decided to go and spend about a week with his parents, so with Sanford's grandparents in LA. So then if anyone came knocking, they could be like, oh no, I was in LA that weekend. But surprisingly, when they arrived in LA, Northcott sat his parents down and told them about the murder. Told them that he'd killed a teenage boy. But he made sure to say that it was in self-defense and the boy was going to kill him and he was just protecting himself. And his mother, being the Norma Bates that she was, she ran straight over to her son, flung her arms around him and said, oh my God, baby, it's okay. You know, you were just doing what you had to do. She was saying, you've done nothing wrong. I'm so glad you're safe. That's all that matters, is that you're safe and that you're here with us. And Sanford just watched as his grandmother praised his uncle for murdering an innocent child. She didn't just accept that this had happened, she praised him for it. It was so terrifying for Sanford to watch, because he knew that if she supported him murdering an innocent child, she would likely support him in the abuse that he'd been inflicting on Sanford all these years. Northcott could literally do no wrong in his mother's eyes. This is a prime example. You know, if a mother is not going to disown their child because they murdered an innocent person, they're not going to disown them for anything. And it's not even like she just accepted him, she supported him through it. So what if she supported him through the abuse of Sanford? Northcott did manage to get away with the murder of that poor unnamed child, because in the 1920s, forensic evidence, was it even a thing? And this left Northcott available and ready to commit this type of behaviour again. A month later, on March 10th, was when Walter Collins disappeared. The first disappearance that we talked about in part 1, the boy that they thought they found, but they actually never did. Well, it's believed that Walter Collins was abducted by Gordon Northcott. This has never been 100% confirmed. It is still officially a theory, but I mean, everyone believes that he did. Gordon Northcott, when he first moved to LA, so before he set up the chicken farm and everything, his family came over from Canada when he was like 18, and he got a part-time job at a grocery store. And this grocery store just so happened to be in the same neighborhood where Walter Collins lived. So it's entirely possible that the two of them knew each other. The two of them had potentially interacted before when Walter had gone to the grocery store with his mother. And if that was the situation, then Walter probably trusted Northcott, because you do when you're a child. You trust authority, people that you see often, you know, the people that work at your local Tesco or something, you know? And Northcott might have been planning to kidnap Walter for quite some time before he actually did it. He was his exact victim type. He was the exact kind of age that Northcott was attracted to, and maybe he was just waiting for the right time. And that right time came along when Walter was walking to the cinema alone one day. Sanford Clark did end up telling the police when all of this came to an end. He said that his uncle had brought a lot of other boys round to the chicken farm, and he believed that one of them was Walter Collins. So from this point on, I'll be telling this story as though it was Walter Collins, but I do just want to remind you here before we get too into it that this is still technically just a theory. So anyway, the night that Northcott brought Walter Collins back to the chicken farm, the day that he abducted him when he was on his way to the movies, he brought him back to the farm and immediately threw him into one of the chicken coops outside. I can't remember if I said this in the first part, but that's exactly why he built all of these chicken coops out in the yard, was so that he could live in his house, but then he could also have all these separate little rooms out in the garden where he could keep hostages. He could keep captives outside in their own little areas where he, you know, wouldn't have to see them or deal with them all the time. So he brought Walter Collins home, threw him into one of these chicken coops, and immediately sexually assaulted him as soon as they arrived home. He then locked him in there and went back into the main farmhouse where Sanford was, and Sanford had been cooking dinner this whole time. So Northcott came in from sexually assaulting his next victim and just sat down for his dinner. Sanford recalled that night, as he was laying trying to sleep on the sofa, he could hear that poor boy screaming, crying for help all through the night. He didn't stop the whole time. For hours, he could hear the pain and the fear in this boy's voice. And Sanford remembered wanting to help him so bad, but he was just so scared. He couldn't. He was frozen, paralyzed with fear. He literally couldn't move from the sofa. Over the coming weeks, Northcott eventually shifted his attention from Sanford to Walter Collins. And Sanford was left feeling very conflicted about this. I mean, of course, he was so relieved that he wasn't putting up with the brunt of his uncle's abuse anymore, but he knew that the reason that he was no longer being abused was because this other younger, terrified young boy was. He suffered with a lot of guilt and a lot of self-hatred, not only for kind of allowing the abuse to be transferred to this other boy, but also for not doing anything about it. He wanted so badly to help this boy escape, but the most that he actually managed to do was he went over to this chicken coop at one point and just told this boy, look, if you're quiet, if you're silent, if you don't fight it, then it'll be over quicker. The most that Sanford could do for this young boy was give him the smallest piece of advice to make the whole abuse easier to deal with. So Walter Collins was in that chicken coop for a few weeks, and this was going on the exact same every day for weeks, until eventually Northcott's family turned up at the Wineville chicken farm rather unexpectedly. They were surprising Northcott. And of course, because he had no idea that they were coming, he'd made no efforts to hide his captive. In fact, when they arrived at the chicken farm, Northcott was actually in that chicken coop assaulting Walter Collins, literally when his parents' car arrived at the farm. And here, Sanford saw an opportunity. So he knew that he could never directly tell Northcott's parents what he was doing because they'd support him and they'd hate Sanford for it, you know. He knew that he wouldn't be believed or supported in this situation. So he knew that he couldn't just outright say it, but if his parents were to catch him in the act, what would they do? You know, technically Sanford wouldn't have done anything. So as soon as his family got out of the car, they walked straight up to Sanford, who was just standing in the yard, and they asked where Northcott was. And Sanford just pointed over to that chicken coop. So Northcott's mother, Louise, walked over to that chicken coop, opened the door, and walked straight inside. And what she saw horrified her. Louise spent the rest of the day screaming at Northcott, screaming at her son for what he'd done to that child in the chicken coop. And he was just crying like a baby. This was one of the first times in Northcott's whole life that his mother had berated him in this way. I mean, the fact that she supported him after he murdered a child says a lot about their relationship. So now the fact that she's finally changing her mind and she's finally not on his side anymore, I think that says a lot. She's now realizing that her son is this monster that is capable of abusing children like this. She's now realizing that all of his intentions towards everything that he'd ever done had always been twisted. Even as far as building this chicken farm, she knew that he never really had any interest in chickens. I mean, he was a very prim and proper guy. He wasn't going to get his hands dirty actually caring for chickens. So they'd always wondered, I wonder why he actually wants a chicken farm if he doesn't care about chickens. This was exactly why. He'd chosen Wineville specifically because it was in the middle of nowhere, had desert surrounding it. He chose a chicken farm specifically so that he could have all these individual coops outside for individual hostages. He did all of this so that he could commit these heinous acts, abduct and abuse young boys without anyone becoming suspicious of it. So Louise is screaming at Northcott in the kitchen. He's crying. He's telling her, no, I promise I'll never do anything like this again. I'll never do it again. He even promised his mother that he would return Walter Collins back to his family, apologize to his family, and then that would be the last of it. She would never hear of him doing anything like this again. And it was at this point, very frustratingly, that Louise changed her mind. Sanford was starting to see some hope here. Louise was berating her son. She wasn't on his side. She was angry at Northcott. So he thought that this was going to be a resolution. but now she changed her mind. Of course, she was always going to be on Northcott's side. Whether she was angry or not, she was always going to warm back up to him. She was always going to take his side. Louise promised Northcott that she would keep this quiet, that she wouldn't report her son on one condition, and that was that he actually followed through on those promises, that he was never going to do anything like this again. But she wasn't so confident about the taking Walter Collins back to his parents part of the plan. She knew that that wasn't going to work. If they took Walter Collins back to his parents, they were going to do something about this. They were going to report this to the police. And she couldn't let that happen. Her main priority here, of course, was her darling son, Gordon Northcott. No matter how much of a monster her son was, she was always going to protect him. She was always going to make sure that nothing bad ever happened to him. And right now, she knew that Walter Collins knew too much. They couldn't let him go. So Louise had some time to think about this situation, and then a few hours later, she called Northcott and Sanford into the kitchen, and she told them that she had a plan. And this plan was going to make sure that none of Northcott's dirty secrets ever got out. She decided that all three of them, herself, her son, and Sanford, were all going to murder Walter Collins. And that way he wouldn't be able to tell anyone. That way, if all three of them were implicated in this murder, that gives each of them the confidence that the others are not gonna rat them out for this. No one can go to the police about this, because if they did, they were literally involved in the murder themselves. They would be snitching on themselves. So Gordon Northcott was more than happy with this plan that his mother suggested. Sanford, of course, on the other hand, didn't want anything to do with this. Of course he didn't want to murder an innocent child. Even aside from that, his own fears for his own life were mounting by the second. He already feared for his life ever since his uncle killed that other boy. But now, if his own grandmother is suggesting to murder her son's victims, which Sanford is, he is one of her son's victims, then what could happen to him? Would his own grandmother want to murder him as well? He knew that from this point on, he could never let a single soul know what had happened to him on that farm. He felt like he was trapped there forever, with no way out, with no allies, with no one that he could ever speak to or get help from, even his own family. And he just feared that he would be killed any day now. But of course, he couldn't afford to disagree with Northcott or Louise at this point, so he made absolutely no outward fuss about killing this boy, and he just agreed to take part. So they all walked over to the chicken coop, and when they arrived, Walter Collins was already passed out on the floor, be it from exhaustion, dehydration, pain. He was already passed out, and that was when Northcott picked up an axe and held it in his hands as he looked down at this innocent little boy. He took a deep breath, looked at his mother, looked at Sanford, and then looked back down at this boy on the floor, and then he lifted the axe and took one big swing at the little boy's head. He did it a couple more times and then passed the axe to Sanford, and Sanford just froze. He looked at his grandmother Louise, who urged him to do it, and so he did. Sanford also took multiple swings at this little boy. Louise then snatched the axe from Sanford and administered the final blows until she was satisfied that this boy was dead. The three of them had just murdered Walter Collins. Their problem was over. He was never going to tell the police. He was never going to tell his parents. And Northcott and his mother just simply turned around, linked arms, and walked back to the farmhouse to go and make some dinner, a celebratory meal. While Sanford actually stayed out in the yard for a little while, he just stayed in that chicken coop and looked at this innocent young boy that he'd just been forced to murder. And when he looked down at Walter Collins, he just saw himself. He just thought how easy it could have been for that to be him that was just killed. Sanford was ordered by Northcott to dig a grave in the yard and bury Walter Collins' body in there. And so he did. And then the nation began looking for this missing 9-year-old boy. The next day, Northcott's mother left Wineville and went back to LA, and all three of them vowed to never tell a soul what they'd done the night before. Before she left, she actually confirmed with Northcott that their deal was still on. He had promised her that he was never going to do anything like this again. She said the only reason that she helped to protect him in this instance was because he promised he wouldn't do this to any other young boys, and he confirmed that. But that didn't last very long at all, because almost exactly 2 months later, Northcott was on the prowl looking for another victim. And this time he got lucky. He found 2. Lewis and Nelson Winslow were 2 brothers aged 10 and 12 years old. And like I said earlier, they disappeared as they were walking home from their parents' yacht club. It's believed that Northcott saw them as they were walking home. He was driving in his car and he decided to pull his car over and strike up a conversation with these 2 boys. These 2 boys were very adventurous, very excitable. They loved to experience new things. They were up for anything. And so when Northcott pulled over, it's believed that he lured them back to his chicken farm on the pretense that they could look after the chickens. They could go and see them, they could feed them, you know. And it's believed that these 2 boys were swept away with this idea. They really wanted to do it. So they willingly got into Northcott's car and drove back to the chicken farm. But once they were there, Northcott locked both of the boys in their individual chicken coops, and they then faced the exact same torture that Sanford Clark and then Walter Collins had both faced. But this time, Northcott was slightly anxious. He hadn't been anxious this whole time. He was very cocky in what he was doing. He believed he was never going to get caught. He believed he was smarter than the police. But this time it was different, because Lewis and Nelson Winslow very clearly came from quite a wealthy family that, you know, obviously cared about them a lot. You know, they looked well loved. They were well dressed. They were clean, hygienic boys. They seemed to come from a very good family. And let's be honest, he literally picked them up from outside a yacht club. So if his parents were rich and powerful and, you know, very clearly looked after their kids very well, they were gonna be doing a lot to try to locate them if they went missing. Northcott knew that if he was gonna get caught with any of these kids, it was gonna be the Winslow brothers. So he knew he needed to do something to stall time, to stop their parents from following the trail back to him. So as he'd done with Sanford multiple times over the years, he decided to sit the Winslow boys down and force them to write a letter to their parents saying not to come and find them, they were happy, they were okay. And this is the letter in which they said they'd run off to Mexico to go and build yachts and planes, and they were with a woman that was feeding them and they were okay. So Northcott sent this letter off to the boys' parents, but still he was overcome with this anxiety. He knew that it was only a matter of time until police would be on the trail of these 2 boys. And it eventually got to the point where he didn't even feel like the risk was worth the reward that he was getting. He felt as though keeping these 2 boys hostage was not worth all this anxiety and stress that it was causing him, and so Northcott knew what he had to do. This time, he went and grabbed Sanford Clark, went and grabbed the axe, put it in Sanford's hands, and said, "This time, you're first." He forced Sanford to go into the same chicken coop that Lewis Winslow was in and take the first blow. He then came in and finished the job, and then the 2 of them went to the other chicken coop where Nelson Winslow was being kept, and Northcott started that one and then let Sanford finish him off. It's actually believed that while Northcott took the first few swings at Nelson, he actually asked Sanford to distract him, to have a conversation with him so that Northcott could approach from behind. So the 2 of them took turns beating both of these boys with an axe, but this time they didn't actually finish them off. The boys weren't actually dead. Northcott ordered Sanford to dig 2 graves, one next to the other, while the boys just laid at the side, moaning in pain and agony. They were bleeding out as they watched another young boy digging their graves that they were about to be buried alive in. When the graves were finally dug, Northcott ordered Sanford to help him pick up each of the boys and throw them into their graves. And Sanford says that he remembers the noises that those boys were making when they hit the bottom of the grave, he said it's something that stuck with him for the rest of his life. And then, like I said, they covered them over with mud and buried them alive. After this, a few more months went by with no further action from Northcott. He didn't try to abduct anyone else, and he went back to just abusing Sanford Clark. Although now he was getting even more cocky than he already was. I mean, he'd already been very confident in his murders and getting away with them. But now he'd successfully murdered 4 people. He'd murdered 3 separate times, the Mexican boy, then Walter Collins, and then the brothers, but that's technically 4 bodies. And his mind was only thinking of the bigger crimes that he could commit now. He was gaining momentum. He wanted more. He was trying to satisfy this urge that he had to murder someone, and just murdering a young boy wasn't enough for him anymore. Northcott had a plan. He decided that he was going to start volunteering at a local poverty shelter where they give, food and clothing to families in need. These were all very vulnerable people that he knew he could gain their trust very easily. And it was there he met and became friends with a family that were in dire need of his help. This was a husband, a wife, and their 2 children. And Northcott decided that they were the perfect victims. He offered the mother and father of this family jobs on his chicken farm, and of course they accepted. Within literally a second of him offering those jobs, they needed that money so bad, and he promised he would accommodate them, they could all live with him. So that same day, he takes this whole family back to his chicken farm, he sets the mother and father to work, lets the kids play out in the farm. He's acting nice right now, he's keeping their trust. And throughout that whole day, Northcott kept going up to Sanford and hinting at what his plan was. He never explicitly said that he planned to murder the family, but he planned to murder the family. And Sanford actually found a new level of confidence in this moment. He decided to tell his uncle what he really thought about this plan. And that was that it was just too risky. It was too big. To capture and murder a whole family was just too much. Besides, he could be very easily traced through that poverty charity that he volunteered at. If this whole family just went missing, of course, the charity are going to know that they were in touch with Northcott. He'd be a number 1 suspect if this family went missing. Of course he would. But Northcott didn't like that Sanford was talking back to him in a way. He didn't like that his nephew was undermining his big plan. He was excited to murder this family, and his nephew was just raining on his parade. So Northcott snapped at him. He beat Sanford and locked him away in a chicken coop and told him that he was going to spend the night in there for talking back to him. But later that night, I think everything that Sanford had said had been playing on Northcott's mind for the rest of the day. And later that night, he actually had a change of heart. He agreed. It was way too risky. He would be a number 1 suspect if anything happened. He knew that he just couldn't do this. So that same night, he fired the mother and the father, and he took the family back to the homeless shelter that they were staying at. And that was when Northcott decided to revert back to his original plan, the plan that had been successful for him multiple times now, which was abducting and murdering young boys. And it wouldn't be long until he found his next victim. Stephen Black was a 15-year-old boy that Northcott met at a local store. Now, 15 years old is not Northcott's usual victim type, and he knew that. But there was something about Stephen Black that just attracted him. He just liked this guy. But he knew that it would be way too dangerous to try and go about this one the same way that he'd gone about previous ones. So in the past with Junior and with Walter Collins, he'd literally just picked the child up and put them in his car because he could. He could physically overpower these 9-10-year-old boys. But Stephen Black, being 15, he was quite big, he was strong, he would fight back and possibly win. So Northcott knew it was too dangerous to do that. He was going to have to go about this some other way. His plan was to go about it in a very similar way that he'd gone about Claude and Philip, if you remember that from part 1. He'd made friends with this guy called Claude and then got on the family's good side, spent a lot of time with the whole family, and then slowly began molesting his younger brother, so no one would suspect a thing. And that's exactly what Northcott was going to do with Stephen Black and his family. So Northcott decided to make friends with the whole family, mainly Stephen's father. He would invite them all around to the farm. They would all have dinner together. He would go around to their house. They loved Northcott, of course. He was that typical charming, charismatic serial killer type. He knew that this was going to be a long journey for him to get what he wanted, to get to the point where he was regularly sexually abusing Stephen Black. He knew this was going to be a long process, but he believed that the end goal was worth it. So that plan was going to be in motion for the next few months, but in the meantime, the Wineville chicken farm actually had a very unexpected guest in August of 1928. Sanford Clark's older sister, Jessie Clark, who was 19 years old at the time, just suddenly appeared on the farm. This whole time that Northcott had been forcing Sanford to write these fake letters back to his family, I mean, for a couple of years they didn't suspect a thing, but with the more recent letters, his older sister Jessie thought that something was up. She said that she just sensed something, like the vibe of these letters was just off. This wasn't her little brother. On top of that as well, Sanford was actually supposed to be enrolled in school, but his handwriting and his spelling still hadn't gotten any better over the few years that he was writing these letters, and she just thought it was a bit weird. And for the longest time, there really wasn't anything that Jessie could do about this. She was a teenager herself, so she didn't have all that much money. She wanted to go over and visit Sanford and make sure that he was okay, but to go all the way from Canada to California, it was a lot of money that she didn't have. But finally now, she had the money. When Jessie arrived on the farm, Northcott switched up completely. He started treating Sanford like a nephew, like he should have been this whole time. He was treating him like he actually liked him. He let him sleep in a bed. He made him breakfast. You know, the past 2.5 years, it was always Sanford had to make every meal for both of them. But now Northcott was making him his breakfast. He was sharing the duties on the farm with the chicken. This was a completely different man that Sanford had known for the past few years. But Jessie could just tell that something was off. Northcott never left her and her little brother alone in a room. He always had to be there. Literally, he took them to stay at a hotel at one point because he was taking them sightseeing, and he didn't even let them sleep in the same room. Jessie could just tell from the way that her brother was looking at her that something was off. There was something wrong in his eyes. That was when he would make eye contact with her. She said that he could barely even make eye contact with her most of the time, which is another red flag. And then just a few days into her stay, Jessie found out why all this was. One night, Sanford waited until Northcott had fallen asleep, and then he went and got Jessie and snuck her out into the yard. And it was there that he whispered to her everything that had been happening to him for the last 2.5 years. That his uncle was an abuser, a rapist, a murderer. He told her not just what their uncle had been doing to him, but what Northcott had been doing to all these other boys as well. He told Jessie about Walter Collins, about the Winslow brothers. He was finally getting all of this out. He knew he could trust his sister in this situation. And he ended it by saying that he felt like it was only a matter of time until Northcott turned on him, until he killed Sanford. Now, Jessie, hearing all of this from her little brother, hearing everything that he'd been through for the last 2.5 years, she was just horrified. She knew that something was up. Obviously from the letters and from the lack of eye contact and the weird eye contact, she knew that something must have been happening, but she thought it must have just been like just abuse. She'd never imagined that this was sexual violence and kidnap and murder. She reassured Sanford that she was going to do something about this. She was going to save him. She was going to get someone to come and get him. She didn't know how she was going to do it, but she was going to do it. And then the next morning, she bought her boat ticket back to Canada so that she could hatch this plan. Now, Jessie knew that she had to be quite discreet about this because I mean, her uncle was clearly a murderer, so if he found out that Jesse had reported him to the police or something like that, then it's likely that he would come after her and try and kill her. Or even if he didn't do that, he might take it out on Sanford. If Jesse was to tell someone something, then Northcott would know that the reason Jesse knows is because Sanford had told her. And Northcott always told Sanford, if you ever tell anyone about what goes on this farm, I'm gonna kill you. So she knew that she had to do this in a slightly discreet way. And that was when she came up with the plan to report Northcott for having an illegal immigrant worker on his farm, not for the abuse, not for the kidnap, not for the murders, but just for smuggling his nephew over the Canadian border to work on his chicken farm, because anyone could report that. She really hoped that this would then get Sanford deported back to Canada so that he would be away from his uncle and that they could start rebuilding his life back over there in Canada. And this finally brings us back to the timeline. Police arrived at the farm that day to find 15-year-old Sanford Clark. By that point, Gordon Northcott had run through the forest. He'd been running for 2 hours while Sanford had been stalling the police. Eventually, when Sanford felt safe enough around the police officers, he stood there and told them everything about the abuse that he himself had sustained over the past almost 3 years on this farm. He told them about the other boys that his uncle had kidnapped and brought back and abused and tortured and murdered. So police set off looking for Northcott straight away. They had no idea where they were going to look for him. They had a feeling that he might try and either flee to LA or maybe all the way back to Canada. So they were the main hotspots where they concentrated their search, but they knew that it was going to be a hell of a task to try and track him down. Meanwhile, Sanford Clark had been transported back to the police station for a number of reasons. Obviously, he needed questioning about his uncle, but he'd also told them at one point during this story that obviously he'd been forced to help murder 3 people now. As far as police were concerned, yes, of course, this boy has been through a lot in his life, a lot. But he also did admit to killing 3 people, so they need to put him in police custody. So the officers sat Sanford down in this interview room and they were questioning him for a while, kind of interrogating him as if he hadn't been through enough in the last 3 years. And it was then that one of the higher up officers came into the room, saw what was going on, and flew into a fit of rage at his officers. He was fuming at his police force for treating this child the way that they were. Sanford himself looked like he was close to dying. He was emaciated, he was pale. Like I said, he hadn't been getting proper sleep or nutrition the whole 3 years that he'd been on that farm. He'd been overworked as well. He'd been working over 12 hours every day for the last 3 years, and physically he was very clearly not in a good way at all. And this police chief was furious that his team's priority at this moment had been interrogating this very clearly traumatized and physically unwell teenage boy. He demanded that Sanford Clark be taken to hospital to be checked over and treated and given all the proper care that he needs. So he was fully checked over, a full physical exam, and every single injury on that boy's body was marked down. And it was there that he was actually found to have permanent physical damage to certain parts of his body from the sexual assault and the sexual violence that he'd sustained over the years. Because not only would Northcott assault him, with his own body, but he would also use foreign objects on Sanford, which had permanently disfigured him. Eventually, when Sanford was treated and nursed back to health, the police, then they could start the questioning. Then it was ethical to actually interrogate him and question him and stuff. And they actually asked him if he wouldn't mind going back to the chicken farm with them so that he could point out where these young boys' bodies were buried. He agreed, and he took the police there, pointed exactly where he dug the graves, because it was Sanford that even dug the graves, so of course he knew where the bodies were. So police started digging them up, but what they found in the ground wasn't exactly what they were expecting. In these graves, they found fragments of human bone not bodies, not even parts of bodies, it was bone. And now this didn't add up with Sanford Clark's stories, because Sanford said that he dug the graves, they'd thrown the boys' bodies in whole, and then filled them back over. So if Sanford was telling the truth, surely they would be finding full bodies in there. And I mean, it had only been a few months since the bodies were buried, so that's not enough time for them to completely decompose and turn into just bone. Police were puzzled. They asked Sanford about it again to see if he was lying, and Sanford said, no, when I buried them, they were full bodies. So police sent these bone fragments off to a lab for testing, and that was where they found that these bones actually had quicklime residue on them. I'm not overly knowledgeable about quicklime, I'm not going to lie to you, but I do believe it is a very corrosive material or a liquid, has irritant properties, and that means that it would slowly eat away at human flesh. And that made so much more sense, because that would explain why they were just the bones. There was no muscle, there was no flesh, no organs, but at the same time there weren't enough bones to make full skeletons. So it seemed as though these graves had definitely been dug up and tampered with, of course, for them to even have got the quicklime on them in the first place. Because Sanford said that they buried the boys literally almost as soon as they were dead. So police theorised that Northcott, when he realised that this was all gonna come to an end, he decided to dig up these boys' bodies, treat them with quicklime so that they would kind of dissolve essentially, and then he got rid of half of them, discarded half of them elsewhere, and reburied half of them. Other than the boys' bodies or the boys' bone fragments, police also found blood all over the chicken coops, and this completely lined up with Sanford's stories. There was blood on particular walls that Sanford said there would be on. In the exact location that each boy was murdered, there was blood found there. Police also found the axe on the property, and it was still covered in blood, like dried blood. Northcott hadn't even made any attempt to clean this axe, and when that was sent for testing, it was found to have 2 different types of blood on it. One which was chickens, which you would expect on a chicken farm, and the other was human blood. There is absolutely no explanation why an axe would have human blood on it if it wasn't for something very, very serious. On top of that, they also found a bunch of items that they believe probably belonged to all of these young boys. Obviously, because the bodies that they found were just bone fragments, that's exactly why none of the boys have ever been fully identified and confirmed as victims of Gordon Northcott's. It's very much believed that Walter Collins was one of Northcott's victims, but because they didn't really have his body, they might potentially have his bone fragments, but they didn't have his body, so they could never properly confirm that. But through these odd little items that they found on the property, that is how they've managed to kind of identify who was Northcott's victims and who wasn't. They found what they believed to be Lewis Winslow's Scouts uniform. I think there was something else that Walter Collins owned, or one of his items of clothing that was found as well. And that's how each of those victims have been confirmed to Northcott. But other than those, there's actually believed to be a lot more victims out there that we've just never connected to him because there was nothing to connect. If he got away with murder for so long, then it's entirely possible that he could have killed more people. Anyway, meanwhile, as all of this search of the farm was happening, police actually managed to locate both Gordon Northcott and his mother Louise as they were trying to board a train in Canada. So they were both arrested and extradited back to America. But this was actually going to take quite some time to get them from Canada to America. It's a lot of paperwork. They had to keep them in a holding cell for a couple of weeks. And in that time, while Gordon Northcott and his mother were being kept in holding cells in Canada, they both confessed to their murders. Louise confessed to the murder of Walter Collins, which we kind of already knew, but then Gordon Northcott confessed to 5 murders. Bear in mind, in this video, we've only talked about 4. We only know about 4. Who is this 5th victim? We still have no idea who he was referencing as his 5th victim. You know, it genuinely could be so possible. But once the two of them were actually brought back over to America, they both recounted these confessions. They said that they didn't mean it. And because they were never official confessions in the first place, they weren't fully recorded, dated, signed, anything like that, they couldn't actually use those confessions in court. They couldn't use them against them. Even though they'd literally confessed, admitted to what they'd done, it couldn't be used. So now both of them are maintaining their innocence and they are due to go to trial. And Gordon Northcott, being the very narcissistic man that he was, he decided he wanted to be his own lawyer. He met with a bunch of attorneys that he thought could represent him, but every single one he met, he just thought they were stupid. He just thought that he could defend himself way better than these other people. He thought they were bad at their jobs. He thought that he was a better lawyer than any of them could ever be. So he was his own attorney. And I'm sure you can imagine how this went. Gordon Northcott was eventually found guilty of 3 of the 4 murders that we've spoken about in this case. The only one that he wasn't found guilty of was that of Walter Collins, which is why it's technically still only a theory that he murdered Walter Collins, because he was never found legally guilty, legally responsible for that murder. I mean, it's very, very, very widely believed that he did murder Walter Collins, but until there's that official verdict, then it's still just a theory, and I don't think we'll ever get that official verdict, considering this happened like 100 years ago. Like I said, he is also believed to be responsible for way, way, way more attempted kidnappings, different sexual assaults, different attacks in general, possibly other murders as well, but again, because he was never found officially, legally responsible for any of those, we don't know about them. Although everyone that's ever looked into this case, professionals or just, true crime enthusiasts, everyone believes that his actual victim count is way, way higher than what we actually know. So his mother Louise also went to trial, and she actually re-confessed. So she confessed in the holding cell, withdrew that confession, and now she's back at trial. She's re-confessing to the murder of Walter Collins. And for that, she was sentenced to life imprisonment. She was actually considered for the death penalty for what she did, but the judge decided to spare her just because she was a woman. A woman that killed an innocent child, yes. I think that's just insane. I just think that's mental. And this life imprisonment sentence that she got wasn't even life imprisonment. She was actually let out after 14 years. 14 years is not life imprisonment. I mean, she died 2 years after she was let out, so I guess she didn't really have much free time anyway. Anyway, like I said, Gordon Northcott was found guilty of 3 of his 4 murders, and he was also put up for the death penalty. And the jury decided that he should be executed for his crimes. It would take 2 years to actually get an execution date for Gordon Northcott. So for 2 years, he was just in prison, rotting in a cell. And at one point, he decided to actually reach out to Walter Collins' mother, the one victim that he actually wasn't found guilty of. And he told Mrs. Collins that if she wanted to come and see him in prison, he would tell her everything. So she did. She had been desperate for answers for years. For years and years and years, she wanted to know what had happened to her son. And she always kind of knew that it was Gordon Northcott, but she just wanted to hear him say it. She just wanted closure. She wanted this to be official. So she went down to the prison. She agreed to meet Gordon Northcott. And when she got there, he just blanked her. He was just silent. He wouldn't make eye contact with her. This was like his final sadistic little game. He knew that this woman was in pain, in so much emotional pain, and he just wanted to lead her on one last time. Just get her hopes up and then crush them. Anyway, finally the time came for Gordon Northcott's execution, and as he waited in his cell to be taken to the gallows, he actually asked the prison guard, "Is this gonna hurt?" So the guard said, "Well, I don't know, probably. I mean, you are gonna die." And that is when Northcott actually requested that he could be blindfolded as he was walked up to the gallows, because he didn't want to see the noose. He didn't want to see what was about to happen to him. On October 2nd, 1930, Gordon Stewart Northcott was hanged at just 23 years old for what he'd done to all of these innocent young boys. In the aftermath of this case, Wineville, the town, actually changed its name to Miraloma because, I mean, this was the only thing it was really known for. It absolutely soiled Wineville's reputation. There was nothing else really there in that town for people to know it by. So when this happened and it was national news and these were known as the Wineville murders or the Wineville chicken coop murders, people never wanted to go to Wineville. No one wanted to move there. No one wanted to visit there. It was really, really affecting the town and its economy. So they had a complete rebrand. Not much is known about what happened to Sanford Clark in the aftermath of this. It's believed that he went back to Canada and there he just had a long and quiet life with his family up there. He never spoke about what happened to him on the chicken farm, and I don't blame him. It was way too traumatic for him to even slightly discuss. He struggled with self-hatred and survivor's guilt for the rest of his life. He blamed himself so much for his part in those murders. He felt like he was unworthy of love. He felt like he was an awful person. Even though he was literally forced into it, he could have been killed himself if he didn't do the things that he did, but he still hated himself every day for what he'd done. The courts did actually find him not guilty of his parts in the murders because they understood that he was acting, well, almost in self-defense, because if he didn't kill, he would be killed. He later went on to get married and he actually adopted 2 children with his wife. He didn't want to have children naturally. He didn't want to reproduce himself because he lived in fear that whatever genes his uncle Northcott had, he was worried that he might have those same genes. Whatever gene it was, whatever kind of brain chemistry thing that happened in Northcott that made him do all of these things, he was terrified that he himself had it and that he could pass that on to another generation. So he never wanted to reproduce. They had 2 adopted children and they lived as happy as they possibly could. I think to say the amount of trauma that this poor boy went through in such a short space of time, just 3 years, I think he did a really good job at trying to move on with his life and actually trying to be happy for himself. There are a lot of people that if they'd been in Sanford Clark's situation, they wouldn't have lived such a long and successful life, you know. But that is all I have for this case. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. If you enjoyed, please leave a big thumbs up down below. That'd really help me out. Thanks again to Acorn TV for sponsoring this video. Remember, if you want to try it out for 30 days for free, you can do if you go to acorn.tv and use the code Eleanor in all lowercase. The link will be down below in the description if you want to go use it that way. Remember, code Eleanor is all in lowercase. Huge thank you to all of my channel members for helping me decide the cases that I cover, especially my tier 2 members whose names are all on screen right now. If you want to become a channel member, you can just click the join button on a desktop or there'll be a link in the description of this video. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. If you want to subscribe to my channel, I post content like this all the time. You can click this link right here. If you want to subscribe to my second channel where I post more light-hearted content, you can click right there. And if you want to watch another true crime video, there'll be a playlist on screen right now. Bye!